Hi, you're just going to get my disembodied voice today. I decided not to do the camera in camera, partly because I'm stuck in a back room in my cabin and you'll see how messy my room is. This is Mrs. McConnell, and I'm going to be working with you throughout the year on writing your AP essays. So let's get started. By the way, I should say I'll be in class next week where we're going to be talking through the details of this essay and particularly the content. Mr. Baca suggested that I record this podcast to get through the how to write an essay part without wasting the time in our short day in class. At any rate, at this point of the class year, you may be wondering just how much information you can actually cram into your mental hard drive and whether you'll be able to retrieve any of it in May when you take the exam. Well, good. Keep worrying. For those of you who hope to get scholarship money or get into a selective college, the AP U.S. History exam really, really matters. More students take it than any other AP exam, and so it gives colleges a lot of useful information, especially when they don't entirely, and probably should not entirely, trust GPAs. The AP exam also tells them something different than your ACT or SAT scores do. It tells them how well you master difficult material. And that's really my point today. A high score tells them that you know how to write an essay. I'd also note that strong essays reduce your reliance on brute memorization. You still need to know a lot. But what I want to talk about today, and even more what we'll talk about in class next week, is how you use your analytical skills to set your essays apart from other students, and maybe even how you can use them to overcome some gaps in your stored information files. This is the first free response question you'll write for me. Today I'm going to talk about how to approach this and similar FRQs, and I hope you'll hang on to these slides for use in future assignments. In class, we're going to walk through the topic and get you ready to write a first-rate first draft. And yes, I did say first draft. You're going to be submitting a second draft to me for this and all subsequent essays, and that's the grade that will stick. And by the way, it's very easy with Turnitin.com to tell if you barely change your essay, and that's going to hurt your grade unless, of course, I said you had a perfect first draft. One of my concerns about JD students when I was teaching AP classes, including AP language and composition, is I discovered that very few of them had much experience with rewriting. It's true, you do not get to rewrite your AP essays on the exam. But rewriting now actually will seriously help you improve your essays. The comparison I often make when I talk to students about this is with drills in athletics. A lot of you play on sports teams. And think about how your coach has you practice your kick or your stroke or whatever over and over and over again. So what's he or she up to? Why do this? Well, the answer is that you're building muscle memory, and you build a kind of muscle memory with writing too. So as you practice doing things right, and you get practice partly by redoing them, you're going to be better able to write a good essay in crunch time. And trust me, the AP exam is a crunch. So anyway, let's get on to approaching the free response question. Here's the question you see. And so the first tip I want to give you is pay attention to the verbs. Note in this verb that the word is analyze. And the word analyze means take apart, examine. It is not just dump the facts on the page. The College Board uses the multiple choice test to see how much information you've retained. It's not that it's completely unanalytical, but a lot of that really is a data dump. They use the essays to see if you've learned how to think historically, to see patterns over time, to understand how underlying factors such as economic change or gender or race or technology have driven history, to perceive variations between regions. They want to see that you understand American histories as well as American history and how these histories come together. Okay, next piece of advice. Pay attention to the time period. Notice the question says confine your answers to the 1600s. No Sitting Bull. He's later. But a strong essay will get out of Jamestown and Plymouth and look at the entire century. Now, it's not that hard to stick in a time period when you're just getting started in the course. On the actual AP exam, you sometimes have trouble keeping decades, even centuries straight. It's a good idea to get in the habit of having a mental timeline. The time period for this essay covers the earliest encounters between settlers and Indians, but it still spans an entire century. I've graded student essays on this question for several years now, and one of the most common problems I see is that students talk about, let's say, Jamestown and Plymouth. Maybe they even get to Lord Loire's Rebellion and King Philip's War, but they don't look at the fallout from these events or later developments. One hint I'll offer now, maybe spare myself some comments inside your essays. If you choose to talk about the Chesapeake region, for example, you really need to talk about Bacon's rebellion as well. It's more important in some ways than Lord Loire's rebellion, and I almost never see it in first drafts. Maybe this year will be an exception. Also, do not forget to talk about change over time. Just to be obvious, Indians are in a much stronger position at the beginning of the century than they are at the end. Why? Well, duh, perhaps, but talk about it. What difference does this make? By the way, the change over time is especially interesting and follows a different pattern in the Southwest. One of the reasons you might think about choosing that region. Okay. Pay attention to the question's requirements. This is a place that you can really mess yourself up. If you don't talk about both Indians and Europeans, and if you don't talk about two regions, the highest score you can get out of 9 possible points is a 4. You do not want that to happen to you. Oops. Just a second. I think I skipped ahead on something here. Actually, I think the problem is I need to go back. My apologies. Okay. So what is the College Board caring about here? The question really shows you that they want you to demonstrate that both the Indians and the European side of the story matter, but even more importantly, that the decisions by each group shaped relationships. A similar question later in the year will ask, in what ways did African Americans shape the course and consequences of the Civil War? I don't know if you all will be assigned that essay, but past students sometimes were, and I graded many essays that talked only about how African Americans were acted upon in various ways. The College Board was looking to see if students understood that African Americans were not merely passive bystanders, but in fact that the actions of slaves who ran away or slaves who fought in the war forced Lincoln's hand and changed congressional actions in some very significant ways. Similarly, I don't think I've ever seen a student essay that didn't try to discuss two regions, but I have graded many essays that mixed up regions. Make sure you keep your Jamestown and Plymouth colonies straight in particular. That's the biggest problem I've seen. New York and New France mean the Iroquois and the Huron in particular. Students choose this region less frequently, but as I'll talk about probably mostly in class, I think that's a mistake. The Southwest should be pretty straightforward. You're talking about Spanish settlements and particularly the Pueblo Indians. Notice that the New York, New France, and Southwest choices give you an opportunity to talk about different sets of Europeans, which can add analytical depth, which leads me to, sorry, now I am ready to advance the slide. Look for similarities and differences. Think for a moment about the poor teacher who's grading your essay. It's June, and you are a free man or woman. The graders, on the other hand, are sitting in a stuffy classroom with lots of other end-of-year exhausted teachers grading hundreds of these essays. They're expected to get through an essay and assign a grade basically in 5 minutes or less. How do you get their ears to perk up and their pencils to mark down a 7 or 8 or 9? I think the best way is to dig a little deeper and to show that you think across regional boundaries and understand how different groups make different choices. The question does not ask you to compare and contrast. Sometimes they will, in which case you have no choice. But I think a question like this invites you to show some analytical depth, at least in your thesis paragraph and in your conclusion, that just shows that you're able to think historically and across obvious boundaries. So, think about which regions to choose. Which ones offer the most interesting similarities and differences? Now, we're going to talk about this more in class. I mean, my time in class is going to be devoted, if you will, to the content, to specific information about the Indians and settlers in these different regions and how you could talk about it with more analytical depth. But again, and remember that on the real AP essay, you may just be looking for the two things that you remember. But again, it's good to dig deeper. On the actual AP exam and on most of the essays I've graded over the years, most students pick New England and the Chesapeake. That's what they remember best. And this essay question was asking them to remember in May. I'm now talking about the actual students taking the AP exam and not the students in Mr. Baca's class. But on the AP exam, it was asking them to remember in May something they'd studied back in August or September. By all means, on the actual exam in particular, go with what you remember. But if you can make a choice, think about what would be most intellectually interesting and maybe not what every other student will choose. So I'm going to ask a question here that I'll return to when I come to class and actually at the very end of this podcast. I'm going to ask Mr. Baca to pause here and to have you answer the following questions just for a few minutes before we go on. How was the experience of New York or New France fundamentally different for Indians than the experience of Indians in different regions? And why was it different? We'll get back to this. Okay, something else that's helpful when you approach these questions. And again, this is something if you practice now, you'll be able to do it, almost automatically when you take the exam. Is think about what matters to the College Board. What do they tell teachers they care about? What are they going to be looking at? I've touched on this already, but cultural diversity is a recurring theme. So is regional disparity. And in this question, you're being asked to demonstrate that you understand the complexity of U.S. history and don't just make simplistic general assumptions. You're also being asked to demonstrate that not all U.S. history was shaped by white males. Not only the settlers, but the Indians played a role in shaping these relationships and that this evolved differently in different regions. Let me tell you a story. I've shared this with classes in the past. My son, Sam, who attended Juan Diego, got a 5 that I think he probably did not deserve on his AP US history test. And one of the reasons was following this strategy. He came back the day of the AP exam. I asked, how did it go? And he said, there was a question about the Progressive Era. And I said, I thought you were hoping you'd get a question about the Progressive Era. You're interested in the Progressive Era. And he said, yeah, but it was a question about women in the Progressive Era. I said, okay, Sam. So what did you write? He said, I wrote this essay about how the Progressive Era was just concerned with upper class women and neglected the concerns of lower middle class and working class women and was really kind of a hoax on the American people or on part of the American people. And I said, Sam, I'm not sure. I personally think that's a good way to approach the essay, but I'm guessing that that's going to raise your grade because it's going to be different than what everybody else is writing and because it's going to please the College Board's prejudices or pander to their prejudices, if you will. And indeed, he did very well. I don't, by the way, recommend that you write something false just to be interesting, but it never hurts to both to try to think about what the College Board cares about and to think about what you might say that's different from what everybody else says. I'm now going to end up by talking about some of the more technical aspects of writing, and Mr. Baca has a handout that's going to look like something that you would get in AP Language and Composition. That is not an accident. I was the first person to teach AP Language and Composition at Juan Diego, and one of the reasons I encouraged them to create that course was because I felt students needed much more experience and practice with reading expository, that is nonfiction materials, and writing good essays. Now, in AP Language and Composition, I tried, and I suspect that your teacher is trying to transcend the formula essay. That's very good. Work at it hard, but these are formula essays. And this is where you go back to the essay structure that you learned in seventh grade. Your basic 5-paragraph structure, although this one may not be 5 paragraphs, but you pick a simple and clear organizational structure that makes it very easy for the AP grader to see exactly what you're doing. In other words, you want to follow the Baptist preacher formula. Tell them what you're going to say in the thesis paragraph. Tell it with clear points, the body paragraphs. Tell them what you said. Write a clear conclusion. Let me make a note here. On the actual AP exam, if your essay is otherwise strong, you can probably get away with not writing a conclusion. They know you're under a time constraint. But these are take-home essays. you have time to write a conclusion, and I want to see one. But if you end up putting a whole lot of interesting information in your conclusion that you've thought of as you wrote the essay, go back and rewrite your thesis paragraph. Yes, you can't do that on the actual AP essay, but remember, you're practicing your writing muscle memory in doing this assignment. Okay, this is a very important piece of writing advice, and this goes for any AP exam and very much for your AP language and composition exam. Support your organizational structure and stick with it. In other words, write a clear thesis paragraph, and we're going to get to that in the next slide, and a clear topic paragraph with each paragraph. Clear topic, I'm sorry, I miswrote that. Clear topic sentence with each paragraph. I will correct that before I send these slides to Mr. Baca. And strong paragraph unity. You may or may not have talked about paragraph unity at this point in AP language and composition. But that means that everything in your paragraph should be relevant to your topic sentence and your analysis. You don't just want to shove in anything you can possibly remember about Indians of the Chesapeake. I'll get to more of that in a minute. Okay, thesis paragraph. Your thesis paragraph should signal not only your organization, but also the main argument you make. One of the most common student errors I see is a thesis paragraph that just restates the prompt. I shouldn't tell you this, and it does not make me happy, but there's a very good chance that your AP reader will only read your thesis paragraph thoroughly and will skim the rest. Your thesis paragraph needs to do some significant work. You need to indicate what you're going to say beyond just which regions you're going to talk about, but you also want to make sure that it's very clear from your thesis paragraph which regions you are going to address in this question. I also think it's a good idea to have an opening hook, something that creates historical context or says why, that you understand why this question was important enough to appear in the AP test. Now, by the way, if you can't think of an interesting way to open, don't. Just cut to the chase. Writing something like "this is a very important question" is deadly. What might be a hook on this topic? Well, did early relationships establish a pattern for the future? Did the change over the century reflect the growth of European settlement and a pushback of Indian settlements? You don't have to be profound, just something that shows that you're looking at the big picture. On the other hand, you could also start with something that was a little anecdotal that captured interest. This has to be short. You do not have time for a lengthy introduction here. But for example, if you were comparing New England and the Chesapeake, you might have an opening sentence that contrasted the generous Squanto and the wily Powhatan, maybe even pointed out that those different strategies produced pretty much the same end result, which is that the Indians got screwed. Okay, strong body paragraphs. I talked about this a little bit earlier, but first, and this is another problem I see in a lot of student essays, include as much historical detail as you can find. The grading rubric that AP essay readers are given for this and all questions puts a great deal of emphasis on historical detail. But make sure, again, that this detail supports your argument. Don't just string together IDs. Relate the detail to your analytical points. Pay attention to your paragraph structure. I talked about this before. Every paragraph should have a clear topic sentence, and your argument should build logically. Don't just stick in random sentences. Again, this can be a little tricky under the time pressure of an AP essay, but you should have an opportunity to reread what you wrote, proofread before you send it in, and think about whether your sentences follow logically from each other. Clean up your sentence structure. Again, I've given you more detail about this in the handout that Mr. Baca will give you. AP graders will not expect perfect sentences because they know that you're writing a first draft under time constraints. But they will still be put off by ungrammatical sentences, by garbled structures, by run-on sentences, sentences with inaccurate subject-verb or pronoun antecedent agreement. You'll have time to work on that in these and subsequent essays. Do it so that by the time you're writing your actual AP essay, that's not a problem. And by the way, those kinds of errors count in a big way on your AP language and composition exam. I assume a lot of you are taking that test. You might as well practice it in more than one course. And by the way, just a note, since this is a take-home essay, please stay off Wikipedia. I mean, that's one of Turnitin.com's virtues. It's very good at catching when you cut and paste and then just change a few words. It'll come right up and show you what words you changed. So don't do it, okay? All right, I'm done now, just about. Let me throw out some analytical questions, and this is going to be our starting point in the next class. We're not going to have a lot of time then, so I want to cut to the chase, the actual content of the subject. These are some things I want you to think about before you come to class, I hope. What options were available to Indians? By the way, this is a general question. Move back from what you know about Powhatan or Squanto or the Pueblo Revolt or whatever, and think, if you didn't know anything, let's say this was a question about, some obscure South American Indian tribe and Spanish settlers. What were the options available to the Indians? What were the options available to the settlers? Think strategically and generally, not specifically for a minute. I think this will actually help you write a much better analytical essay. And then, when you've thought about that, what basic strategies did each group follow in each region? And did these strategies vary? Remember my earlier recommendation, you may want to pick regions where you can identify some similarities and differences and use that to strengthen the analytical depth of your essay. I asked this question before, I'm throwing it out again. How was New York, New France different from the other regions? Are there any problems with using the generic terms such as European or Indian or even, and this is a hint about how you would talk about the Southwest, Catholic? There are different kinds of Indians, different kinds of Europeans, and this actually is really important in thinking about the Southwest region, different kinds of Catholics. I look forward to seeing you in class.